Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of Between the Covers. It feels like it's been so long since I did the first episode. I know it's only been a month, but I've actually really enjoyed this because it's kind of held me accountable to not just reading books but actually finishing them as well. I have a bad habit as a reader of picking up more than one book at a time, and I can have 5 or 6 books on my bedside table that I'm reading between, and quite often I don't necessarily finish the books as well, depending on what type of books they are and my mood at that point in time. So this has actually been really good because it's helped me to sort of stick to a game plan and to actually finish things that I start as well. Not only that, with working with the decks, I've really found that a month is probably more than enough time for me. I always like to work with new decks, or if I'm in a particular energy of working with one particular deck at that time, I like to work with that one as well. Usually it'll be for a couple of weeks. However, working with it for a month, I've found that it's really given me a lot more of a in-depth connection to the decks in general. So I'm looking forward to continuing to do this series. At the time of recording this, I should say, I've already started working on next month's stuff. So, and I'm really excited for next month as well. So let's get into today's reviews. So I'm starting off with my fiction novel today, and the book that I read is How the King of Elfham Learned How to Hate Stories, and this is by Holly Black. So I just want to put a quick message in with this one that it's not exactly part of a series, but it is at the same time. So this is part of the Folk of Air series by Holly Black. So that's The Cruel Prince, The Wicked King, and The Queen of Nothing. And this is kind of like, how do I describe this? It's kind of like a cross between sometimes a prequel, sometimes it's after these stories as well. So it's sort of like in between. You probably wouldn't have to worry about reading the entire series before picking this up, but it would make more sense if you had. However, the way that this book is styled, you could kind of pick it up and just read it and still get the same kind of information from it. So I had this on my shelf for a little while and I hadn't read it yet. I actually really do love Holly Black and her style of writing, and the way she creates worlds. She's one of my favourite fantasy writers, especially with working with the energy of the Fae and the world of the Fae. I really enjoyed this previous series, The Folk of Air. So, this was one of those things that I kind of had been umming and ahhing about purchasing it, and then I finally purchased it, and then it sort of sat there for a little while. So because it's not an actual novel, so this is it's kind of like an adult children's book. I'll show you. So like the pages, for example, have got images throughout. The artwork is really pretty. You can see here that it's just it's not like an actual novel. So, and each chapter is not a follow-on from the chapter before it, so they're kind of like individual short stories within one book, but they're all about one of the main characters in the original series, so the King of Elfham, or Carden. I think it's Cardan, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. So it's all about his story. So it kind of follows, it goes like back to his childhood, it goes into, what's happened at the end of the series. I don't want to mention too much because for those of you who want to read the series, I don't want to put spoilers in there for you. So it's quite fast paced. Like, I didn't read this in one sitting just because I was jumping between books like I usually do, but I did pretty much you could finish this in one night. It's very easy reading. It's probably not as intense as or as well done as I would say the actual novels were, but I do think it's worth having in your collection, especially if you do have Holly Black books or you have read this series in general. It's definitely worth having. And even if you don't have anything, I kind of feel like it's worth having just for the artwork alone, because the artwork combined with the story, as I said, it gives it that adult kind of fairy tale novel feeling. And it's just kind of a really pretty book worth having in the collection. I like to have entire series, so if there's a book that comes out, like even if I don't read it for years and years, I like to have the entire series. I like to collect. Would I read it again? Maybe. If I'm going through and reading the entire series again, I would probably do it then, just because it's kind of, that's what I do. If I reread a series, I have to read everything that's in it, but I would probably just flick through it very quickly or skim read it. You kind of get the gist of it after reading it the first time. So overall though, I definitely feel like it's worth having in the collection, especially if you do appreciate her work. And again, if you appreciate really nice artwork as well to go along with it. So moving into the non-fiction side of things. So the book that I worked with this month is called Sacred Contracts by Caroline, I'm not sure if it's Myss. I'm going to say Myss. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. So I've also had this one for a little while on the shelf. I do have another of her books that I will read at some point, which is, actually sorry, I have two of her other books. I have one that is working with the chakra energy, the anatomy of the spirit, and I also have another one which is called Archetypes. This one, none of the books connect obviously because it's non-fiction, so it doesn't matter what you're working with. She does have an oracle card deck as well, and that's the archetype cards. I really like working with those cards. I don't use them enough, but I do like that deck. This particular book, it surprised me. I have to admit that when it comes to reading self-help books or informational books, I'm one of these people that I really need to, I can go into something full steam ahead kind of thing, and I can really read it, and then if I don't continue to stay at it, I'll like read it maybe for a couple of nights and then put it down, because I mean, let's face it, reading self-help books or informational books just aren't as fun. As much as I love knowledge and gaining new knowledge, it really takes a lot to hold my interest, to keep me reading it from cover to cover. That's also because I'm a fantasy writer myself, so fantasy and fiction are my thing. That's what I enjoy reading. But again, I do love information and learning new things. So going into this one, I was very surprised. It did take me the entire month to sort of go through it, and I almost find with reading self-help books and informational books and history books and all of these kind of spiritual books and stuff, I do find it's probably easier if you do go through maybe like one chapter at a time or only a couple of chapters at a time to let the information sink in. Otherwise it's kind of like you're overloading yourself. That's how I find anyway, how I feel with reading it. With this particular book, that's kind of the approach that I took, and I actually do feel like this is a book that I want to pick up again, because there's a lot of information in here that even though it's kind of there in my mind, I really want to go back at a later time to review. This does have like exercises that you can practice and things like that, and I didn't really do that. I didn't go in depth as much as I could have. However, I do want to say too, going into reading this book, I have a good understanding of contracts in general, like sacred contracts. I have a good understanding of the shadow self. I have a good understanding of archetypes. So going into this book, that back knowledge that I already have did make some parts of this book a little bit, I kind of skim read it just because I already had a lot of that knowledge there. So the premise of this book is really talking about your soul contract. It's essentially your soul contract. In this book, she does combine a lot of different information. It's her own interpretation and her own version of taking the works of, for example, Carl Jung, and even working in like things like Plato's information and stuff of all about the collective unconsciousness, the shadow self, the archetypes that we have as a human in terms of our personality. So she kind of brings her own interpretation to it, and I'm someone who actually really loves Carl Jung's work on shadow work and the collective unconscious, and the understanding the psyche of the human mind and the psychology aspect of that. So I have quite a few books with Carl Jung's work, so it was very interesting to have her interpretation of this. There was quite a few things that I sort of found. It's one of those books for me that I read, you know, it'd be one sentence that would just click and make me go, wow, that just puts everything into perspective and everything into place for me. And then other times I'd sort of skim read through a bit because it was very informational kind of stuff that I didn't really need to. I already had a good understanding of it, so I sort of had to skip through those parts. Carl Jung's work is based on like 12 archetypes, and her work is based on a lot more than that. But in some ways it's kind of a lot better because it goes even more into the individual personality traits that we have. And the way she sort of works this book and this structure is explaining how each individual person can have 12 archetypes within their personality that have both got a positive and a negative component, and how they help shape who we are as a person and the things that we encounter in life, our life experiences, and how we can recognize them in order to harness essentially our soul's purpose, our soul's contract in this lifetime, and how to work with those things, with these energies, in order to maximize our potential. That's kind of trying to put it in a nutshell. It's a lot deeper than that though. It does go deeper into understanding the reasons why things can happen, why they can occur. It goes into quite a lot of detail in the very beginning of the history of sacred contracts in general, and using situations throughout history as a way to explain it and interpret it. So for example, it would be looking at Jesus Christ and his sacred contract coming into the world and why certain things happened, and you know, those kind of things. It could be looking at like the Buddha and energies like that. So there's a lot of examples throughout the book of clients that she has worked with throughout the years and applying their situation into interpreting one particular aspect of the archetype that is coming through, and using that as an example, so you can kind of get a broader understanding. In the back of the book there is an appendix which has the list of every single archetype and how they can relate to you, what the archetype stands for in general. I do love as well, when you get further into the book, one of the things that I really enjoyed was that she actually brings in layers of astrology, and not just, you know, looking at it as zodiac signs, which is another thing that Carl Jung, for example, has explored, the archetypes of astrology and the zodiac signs, and how that applies to the human mind and the collective unconsciousness mind. So, and I personally am doing my own study into astrology and deepening my connection with astrology. So I found that quite interesting because she goes deeper into understanding the houses and how you can layer the archetypes of your personal makeup, that what you are born with, your personal individual archetypes, and layering them into the astrological houses, and then applying that to a greater understanding of how these archetypes play themselves out in your life and how they can be detrimental and how can they can also be beneficial. So it's definitely one that I do want to go back at a later time to go through the exercises a little bit more, to really go into depth with how they would work and how they interact in my life. I mean, I did a little bit of it, but not really in depth. But yeah, it's definitely a book that I recommend. It's a great one for beginners if you're wanting to start getting into understanding the shadow self or shadow work in general, understanding archetypes and how to work with archetypes and how to apply it from both a spiritual perspective, a scientific perspective, a health perspective, and just a general perspective as well. It's definitely one that I would recommend for beginners as well as people who are quite well into their spiritual journey as well. So definitely one that I mean, I would give this a 5-star rating if it was out of 5 stars. So okay, last but not least is the Oracle deck that I worked with this month. Now, this is one that I've had on my shelf for a while now. I have worked with it intimately a few times before, but not for very long. And I actually am so glad that I chose this particular deck to work with, and found my connection to this deck just deepened so much throughout the entire month. And it's changed my perspective on how I see the deck, how it interacts with my daily life, and how I'm going to approach it with working with readings. So when I say I'm working with decks for a month, what I want to kind of put in here quickly is I don't just intuitively read the cards. So working with a particular deck, I like to understand the artist's perspective on the images, on their interpretation of the cards, and sort of how they came to create the deck. Because when you're working with each individual deck, tarot, oracle, no matter what it is, you're picking up the energy of the original creator. So while I do like to intuitively read, and when I do my own readings, I pick up my own messages, my own interpretations, and that kind of energy, I still like to kind of stay true to the original messages in the cards as well. And the only way you can do that is by reading the guidebooks. Now, I know that a lot of readers in the spiritual community don't do that. They won't necessarily touch the guidebook at all when they get a new deck. But to me, I like to understand the story behind each individual card and the story behind the creator of the deck, and why that they have created the card to look a particular way, how the story lays out. So when I work with a deck, how I do it is I draw a card each day for myself. If I'm getting the same card a few times, I will actually draw a different card, only because even though the individual messages are still guidance for me personally for that day, I'm still trying to get to know the entire deck. So if I pull the same card many times, I understand that that's already an individual message that I need to be aware of, and it's obviously something I'm working through, but I will reshuffle and try to get a different card as well, because the entire purpose of this is getting to know the deck. It's like going on a date with the deck. So, and then what I do is I will read the guidebook to understand the messages coming through from the card. Then from there, I actually will journal it in my daily journal, and I'll write down what the daily card is, the interpretations from the guidebook. Sometimes I'll add in my own interpretation or highlight something that is very significant for me at that particular time. The reason why I like to journal essentially the same kind of message that's coming out of the guidebook is because it kind of cements in, it's like learning. You know, most people will say that it's easier for someone to learn when you write things down, and the more you write something down, the more it's repeated in your mind and you are going to remember it. So this is the reason why I like to do that, because it means the more I work with these cards, or when I work with that card next time, that's going to be in my subconscious mind somewhere, and it's going to help me develop a deeper interpretation of the card, and have a deeper connection to that particular deck, because I choose decks based on themes, on energies. So it's based on the story that the deck tells, and each deck has its own individual story, and I like to stay true to some degree to the individual story of that card. So that's how I personally work with the deck throughout the month. And this is not something that I use as, like, for example, my daily readings that I post on my social media or anything like that. I'm using a different deck for that, and I'm using my own interpretations, as well as the messages through the individual card story as well. So this is just my way of doing it. I just wanted to sort of explain it quickly, because I wanted to make it clear how I work with them. I can go into a deeper video at some point if people would like to go into it more. I have done a video before on working with tarot and oracle cards, but I can go a lot deeper into how I work with the cards, how I interpret cards, and the reasons why. If people are interested, if you are interested, let me know in the comments down below. So anyway, let's get straight into this one. The deck that I worked with is the Chakra Insight Oracle, and I love having different style decks, because obviously this is a chakra oracle. I like to have decks. I mean, I'm a deck collector. I've got, the last count I did was about 130 odd decks. I like to collect decks. I like to have a different theme for stuff. Chakras was one that I didn't have for quite some time. And then when I did get this one, I chose this one based on the artwork, because the artwork is simply stunning, absolutely stunning. I will show you some of the cards in this artwork. And I'm someone who does like to choose decks based on the artwork in general. So I'll just go through some of these cards for you. Of course, they're all going to be like, these pictures don't even do it justice of just how stunning this deck can be. It's very realistic in terms of the art in general. It's very easy to understand what card it represents what, and what chakra you're connecting with. As you can see, they also have the individual messages or prompt words written on the bottom as well, and I love that about decks. That's the last one that's there. So I do love when I choose an oracle deck. It's probably almost in some ways a habit that's left over from when I was first beginning to work with decks, but I prefer decks that have some kind of prompt words on the card in some way, shape or form. I don't choose decks that are just images or very hard to understand what the card is, because I like to, even though you're reading intuitively into the images, I also like to have a message of some sort, a word of some sort that is going to prompt me to the energies that I'm picking up on. Because otherwise, to me, I look at it like, well, there's no reason to use a card, then I'd just be tuning into my own intuition and getting what messages come through. So I liked a deck that has prompt words. Now, not only does it have prompt words, the colors, as you can see on these, are all different. The borders are all different colors, and there's kind of the same kind of theme, which is based on each individual chakra. And that's another thing that I really like. I mean, it is a little bit confusing when you get to the third eye and the crown chakra, because they are both like a purpley color. Let's just get, and if you're not seeing them next to each other, it can sometimes be a little bit hard to tell the difference between the two of them, because you have like this pink purpley kind of color, which is crown chakra, and then you have this indigo kind of purple color. So depending on it, because when you look at chakra energy, some people's interpretations of the chakra, the crown chakra for example, is a gold color or a white color. You know, then you get the purple colors and stuff as well. So it depends on what you work with. Myself personally, I've always worked with the crown chakra as being a white or golden energy, so it did take me a little bit of time to readjust to that with this particular deck. However, the cards are so easy to understand with their messages that it doesn't really matter if you have a good understanding of the chakras or not. You don't need to have, you can go into this with no knowledge whatsoever of what the chakra energy is. I'll just show you the back too, sorry. The other thing that I really like as well is that this guidebook is quite, it's quite in depth. It's got quite a lot of information, but it's not too overwhelming. As I said, with how I work with decks, I do work with the guidebooks as well. So when there's a guidebook that's got quite a lot of information, I do feel like that's in some ways a very beneficial thing, because the creator has put a lot of time and effort and energy into providing you with information about the cards itself. So I'm just going to open it to a random page. So when you get to an actual card, for example, sorry, I will just say there in the introduction, she does go into a little bit of detail of understanding what the chakras are. For those of you who don't know, there is obviously some messages here for different spreads that you can use as well, and then you go into the card messages. So when you get to the card messages, what I do love about it is it repeats the name of the card, if it's going to focus, and then the prompt words. There's like a little snapshot of a saying that kind of relates to it, and then the first paragraph is a description of the card, of what's in the card. Now the reason why I find the descriptions quite significant is because it goes more into the story of the card. It goes more into understanding how come that image and the layers within that image and things that you may not have necessarily noticed to begin with, why they're in there and how they relate to that energy in that chakra. And then it goes into the card message of interpreting the message. They're very straight to the point, easy to understand messages. And then the next thing that I love about this guidebook is in the back, she has a chakra table here, which actually talks about the individual chakras. You know, it'll talk about their names, the different colors, where it's located, the elements, what it's related to, what parts of the physical body it's connected to, the archetypes that it's connected to as well, planets, the astrology aspect, crystals that you can work with, and oils that it's connected to. It talks about when it's in balance, so what characteristics you can experience when it's in balance, what characteristics you can experience when it's out of balance. Then there's also information on how to balance it out. So like there's a how to tend to that chakra if there's an imbalance of some sort, so which includes foods, activities, affirmations, as well. And then there is also additional information, where are we? Here. So in the back it goes into even more additional information on how to balance your chakras, and different things that you can do. So there's a lot of information here. Chakras was something that I had quite a lot of knowledge in going to this book anyway, so I hadn't really referenced too much to do with the back of the book with the guides on it. However, if you're someone who has little to no understanding of the chakras, I would highly recommend this deck, because not only is it going to give you hands-on experience of working with the energies of the chakras and understanding them, especially if you do it on a daily basis or even a weekly basis, how to work with those individual energies, how they're being applied in your life from the oracle perspective, but then it's also the practical component of understanding the chakras, how to work with them, how to cleanse them, how to balance them, you know, working with the archetypes, all of that kind of stuff. So it's packed full of so much useful information, as well as being an actual oracle deck as well. And I found for myself personally, working with these cards each day, because there's sort of like questions when you're reading the card interpretations and the messages from the card, she kind of puts in some ways some questions to ask yourself, to reflect on. And this was something that I found very beneficial, was reflecting on the messages from the cards for the day throughout my day. And it just kind of, it made me more aware of working with that individual energy and sort of just the energy with my life in general, and plotting where I wanted to go, where I wanted to move forward in my life. So I did find this a really, really beneficial deck, and it's probably gone up on my list of decks of that I have here, of one that's actually probably in, I would most likely put this in my top 10 decks, where it wasn't before I started working with it intimately. So highly, highly recommend this one for you as well. So this is the end of the video. I had tried to keep it a little bit more shorter than my original one. However, I have no idea if this is actually any shorter than previously, but thank you guys so much for tuning in to watch this. I hope this has given you a little bit of information and some food for thought on reflecting on maybe some books that you want to get or decks that you want to get. If there's particular ones that you have or have seen me use in other videos, please let me know if you'd like to me to go into more detail about them, because I can add them into like my next month's list, for example, to work with, so I can sort of review it a little bit more as well. So, or if you have suggestions as well, I'd always appreciate that. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next new moon. Bye.